Welcome to Digital Mental Health Musings, a podcast series from the eMental Health in Practice initiative, providing health practitioners with the latest news and developments in digital mental health services and resources. MPRAC acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we bring you this conversation. We acknowledge elders past and present and honour their continuing connection to land, culture and community, and that it's these connections that are intertwined in Indigenous mental health and social and emotional well-being. We acknowledge the strength and resilience of all First Nations people and communities since colonisation of their unceded lands. Hello and welcome back to Digital Mental Health Musings. I'm your host, Dr. Tanya McMahon, and today we're delving a little deeper into, the topic of the hour, the world of AI, algorithms, and chatbots. But more specifically, we're talking about the legal and ethical principles and dilemmas that can help inform the use of this new technology within the mental health setting. So at MPRAC and on this podcast, we profile evidence-based digital mental health tools and services developed by publicly funded medical and educational institutions. Many of these are co-designed with people with lived experience. All are free and low-cost national services that have undergone really rigorous evaluation within a medical ethical framework. But increasingly, and particularly since the pandemic, more people are being exposed to commercial digital therapy, whether that's through biometric data collection via smartwatches and phones, or through targeted online advertising for paid digital mental therapy apps and subscriptions through social media, or simply by searching for self-help online. People are now being offered digital mental health therapy products that have been created outside of the healthcare setting and without the promised duty of care that the healthcare system brings. Now, of course, while health professionals are governed by their own ethical obligations, how do they help clients navigate these products and services developed by companies and individuals that might operate through a different ethical lens? We've all been hearing about the rise of big tech AI, algorithms, and chatbots. And as these technologies become more established, crucial questions have emerged among mental health care professionals. Is commercial use of AI in the mental health setting safe? Is it ethical? What protections could help ensure privacy, transparency, and equity as these tools are increasingly used across society? One person who's been examining these issues is Dr. Piers Gooding. Piers is a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne Law School. He's a socio-legal researcher, and his work focuses on the law and politics of disability and mental health, with an interest in algorithmic and data-driven technology. He's also authored books, journal articles, and has written for The Conversation about technology and mental health. And he's on the editorial board of the International Journal for Mental Health Capacity Law. So Piers is joining me today to unpack some of the ethical and legal issues around AI and the use of algorithmic data in mental health. Piers, thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Tanya.
So you've written extensively on the intersection between digital mental health, law, and ethics. And I wanted to ask you first, what drew you to this field in particular? Why did it become important for you to examine the social, legal, and ethical implications of digital mental health?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's an interesting question. I mean, my background, as you mentioned, is as a socio-legal researcher. So that means I've got an interest in looking at the law in its social and political context. And for the last 10 years plus, I've been looking at mental health related law and policy. That's really an area that I'm quite interested in and I suppose deeply passionate about it in a lot of ways. And I suppose despite looking at that, in the last few years, I sort of saw the emergence of digital technologies that really hadn't received attention from legal scholars, but which I thought warranted attention. I had been looking at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a major UN human rights convention, and it has major implications for laws concerning mental health, whether in criminal law or in laws concerning civil commitment and involuntary treatment. But I also think that a lot of the lessons from human rights and a lot of the lessons from the broader field of law concerning mental health had a lot to offer to this emerging area of digital technology that was springing up in the mental health context. So around 2018 and 19, I sort of thought, well, why don't I just start dipping my toes in the water? And I wrote a brief article trying to survey the field and map the legal issues concerning digital technologies in mental health. And then applied for a little bit of funding to explore it further. And then in the midst of all that, COVID happened. And as you're well aware, and I'm sure your listeners are too, it served as a bit of a rocket fuel for accelerating digital mental health technologies around the world. And so with that, the issues proliferated. And in that time, I suppose the last 5 years, I've just seen almost monthly some kind of issue arise in media around something that's ethically or legally problematic in the broad and expanding world of digital mental health technologies. And you mentioned it in your introduction, but I was quite interested in some of the commercial drivers of the field and the vast sums of capital, I suppose, that have been invested in digital mental health that have probably flowed from Silicon Valley and the kind of broader rise of the information economy. I mean, now the biggest companies in the world are the likes of Apple and Microsoft, some of whom have bigger sort of profit margins than some countries have GDP. So these are massive entities that are changing our relationship with the internet and generating and trading more data about us than ever before. And a lot of that data concerns behavior, which has a sort of natural alignment with questions about measuring mental health. So, I mean, just as one example of the amount of capital being invested in 2021, digital startups focused on mental health reportedly secured more than $5 billion in venture capital, which was more than double for any other medical issue. And I think it goes back to that question of well, why mental health? Why is it receiving double any other medical issue? And I think it's that question of behavior and the kind of markers that our whole information economy is designed to identify are matters relating to our behavior. And I suppose that can be used in the mental health context to try to address people's distress or direct support to people as they need it. So given all of that, I just saw a real lack of legal scholarship in the field, and I thought it would be an interesting place to explore. And it has been thoroughly interesting, and I've been able to connect with some wonderful scholars all over the world, as well as practitioners. And one thing I like about the space so much is that it's really interdisciplinary. You can't really talk about it without speaking with people from psychology and psychiatry and computer science and law and media studies. And then there's lots of organizations representing mental health service users who are quite interested in this question as well. So the really rich discussions happen with all of those people around the table often.
Yeah, and you're right. It really is an exciting area to be in, because it really feels like it's changing month to month. It really is a double-edged sword too. You're saying before, we've had this really massive acceleration in this space from COVID, and we've noticed that too as clinicians and health practitioners working in mental health. There's been this huge proliferation of digital tools and services and products available, which is great in terms of providing equitable, more equitable access to people. But at the same time, the ethical implications of that, the other side of the sword, has also been just as overwhelming, and we're all having trouble keeping up with what this means for us and what some of the pitfalls might be. So we're so interested to be able to hear your insights in particular in this emerging space. You've been looking at the social implication of a really broad range of technologies in mental health. So obviously some of the longer standing categories that people might be familiar with, like online counseling services, to the more recent and emerging technologies like biometric monitoring, and then AI machine learning, which, is claimed to be able to predict risk of self-harm and predict certain diagnoses through social media use and things like that. The field is moving at an incredibly rapid pace. And you've pointed out in your work that technological change makes it possible for people to act in new ways towards each other, where these actions need to be governed in ways for which there are no precedents. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and that's I think one of the first lines from probably the first paper that I wrote on the whole topic. And I'd say my views have changed somewhat, but I think the truth of that statement stands, and that is that technology changes in ways that our regulatory and legal systems may not be able to catch up with. So there may not be appropriate regulatory safeguards to identify when data concerning mental health is being misused. But at the same time, since I've written that, I've rather come to a different conclusion, or a way that I would frame it slightly differently. And that is to say that there is a bit of a myth that technology outpaces law. And I think it might be a myth that is often advanced by technologists who may be overlooking the law, because you don't need a specific legislation concerning digital mental health, for example. And the reason I say that is because digital mental health is very broad, and it is going to occur in a multitude of areas. So it might occur, for example, in teletherapy, and in rules around teletherapy could simply be governed by Australian health practitioner regulation, and ensuring that health practitioners have sufficient credentials, and consumer protection law, where anyone presenting therapy as a service needs to be very clear about the credentials of the person who is going to be providing it online. So there you have health regulation and consumer protection law, two different areas of law that needn't change to be enforceable or to still apply, but which may need to be applied in different contexts. And you can see regulators starting to look at how they can apply existing laws to new practices. So in the US, for example, we were discussing large commercial providers of teletherapy. There's a company called BetterHelp, which you've probably heard of, and many of your listeners, if they are podcast listeners, will probably have heard of, because they're often advertised at the beginning of podcasts, or at least there was a huge range of advertisement in that domain of late. But that company was fined $7.8 million by the Federal Trade Commission of the US for allegedly, and the company has since acknowledged it and have agreed to pay, for sharing personal data of its users with third parties, and particularly big social media companies like Facebook, TikTok, and others, when they had explicitly promised service users that they would not share that information. So there you have, again, an old law around misleading conduct and deceptive conduct simply being applied in the new context of digital technologies. And certainly it required some creativity on the part of the regulators to have a look at what they were promising, and then use some technical techniques to identify that third parties like Facebook were receiving sensitive personal data. But at least it reveals to us that we don't necessarily need new laws, but we do need robust application of existing laws to the new context of service provision, of product sale that is facilitated by the digital economy, I suppose you could call it.
Mm.
Okay, so let me make another caveat, and that is that in some instances, perhaps you will need new laws, and that's where you really need a rich discussion between, I suppose, people who are knowledgeable about the field, legal scholars and lawmakers, service users and others, where it might be important to put in extra protections. And I suppose
Mm.
we're seeing that in the revision of things like privacy law and data protection law, both of which are subject to a round of reform in Australia. And those are areas which are uniformly agreed to require law reform in order to address the contemporary possibilities of new technologies. But let
Mm.
my overarching message be that we need to apply the current law, and there are many current laws that apply and arguably are being breached. And then in some limited circumstances, it's likely that there will need to be new forms of governance and legal oversight.
Mm. I must say that's very reassuring to hear, because as a health practitioner, and most of us don't have very detailed legal knowledge, it can be easy to think that these new technologies, which we're just trying to kind of grasp, just escape, all the other laws and regulations that we're used to in our work. So it's very reassuring to hear that, for the most part, with some creativity, and like you said, robust application of existing laws, that digital tools and services don't just automatically escape the current laws because, by virtue of being digital, that there might be certainly some new cases where we might need new laws, but there will be many cases where existing laws will do the job.
Absolutely. I really, if there's one message that I could convey, and that's the one, that a lot of these traditional mechanisms of governance, ethical guidelines, professional guidelines, laws that apply regarding health law, consumer protection law, and indeed criminal law when it comes to, negligent sort of divulging of data and so on, really still do apply. And it would be, I think, to uncritically accept that myth that I think, again, is sometimes put forward by people who have a vested interest in rushing ahead with some of the technology without necessarily hiring a lawyer to inquire as to whether it's appropriate or being subjected to the kind of critical oversight of existing regulation. It'll be very interesting to see how BetterHelp respond to this latest complaint and subsequent fine, and whether they will improve their data protection practices. Certainly in other areas of technology companies, there are examples where people accept those kind of fines as sort of the price of doing business. And I certainly hope that's not going to be the case here. And hopefully the actions of the FTC will embolden other regulators to inquire about this area, given the sensitivity of the personal data that's at stake.
Absolutely. And so I wanted to chat specifically about a particular digital tool, chatbots in particular, because they raise a specific range of ethical issues like privacy, transparency, accuracy, safety, accountability. Obviously, the importance of these ethical issues is only going to grow as the chatbots become more sophisticated. Obviously, we could probably spend an episode, unpacking each of those separately, but just focusing, say, on privacy and data collection. What do people need to be aware of in terms of that when it comes to chatbots?
Gosh, I suppose with chatbots, I've been quite struck of late by some of the developments in 2023, particularly with the rise of these large language models like ChatGPT. So in June, for example, it was reported that a major US charity that was providing teletherapy to people with eating disorders fired its staff and then replaced them or introduced a chatbot that used generative AI. So that generative AI is not just the kind of script. You put in a prompt and then there's a predetermined script that comes up. That's, using AI, as many of your listeners will know, to come up with text that is seemingly reasonably a good response to what has been written. But in that instance, the chatbot was deactivated almost immediately because it gave people dieting advice. It was giving dieting advice to users of an eating disorder service.
Wow.
And earlier in the year, there was a company, Coco, an online mental health chat service, which also attracted controversy by experimenting with large language model chatbots on about 4,000 young people. And service users were notified that some use of a chatbot may occur, but it was clearly poorly understood by users who raised serious concerns after that experiment had happened. And it couldn't have been said to satisfy the standards of informed consent. So these are just some of the issues unfolding. And to go back to your question, in those cases, I'm not sure privacy is the key concern so much as the provision of kind of advice that couldn't really be seen to satisfy the demands of a sort of duty of care, and potentially questions around undermining individuals' autonomy and dignity by failing to sort of satisfy those high standards of informed consent that we'd like to think really characterize this area concerning very sensitive discussions. But nevertheless, I suppose those chatbot companies could very easily be, gathering data about individuals who use the service in the same way that, for example, BetterHelp would if you signed up to something and your email is in their database. Well, you'd like to think that email was being protected and not sold to third parties, as was the case with BetterHelp. But BetterHelp is a company that I've got a figure here. They generated in 2022 reportedly over $1 billion in revenue. Now, I think we should take some of those stats with a grain of salt, because although they may have generated revenue, there's also that doesn't necessarily tell us what they spent in outlay. And sometimes these big tech companies like Uber or something are famously not very profitable because they're spending so much in order to try and get a large market share. So I think we can take it with a bit of a grain of salt, but at the very least we can identify that is a huge company that is just has a huge market share. And the fact that they were saying that they wouldn't share your data with third parties, and that they were breaching that promise flagrantly, should ring alarm bells for all of us, I think, and to be extremely cautious in the way information is shared, if that's really sensitive to you as an individual. So the pessimistic view would be, anything that you type into one of these things, you probably should imagine that it could potentially released. Yeah. But maybe that's a glass half empty view. But I mean, the consequences could be quite dramatic if something did get out. So I would just recommend caution and maybe turn the attention to ensuring that our regulators have robust oversight of these kind of operations.
And it sounds like what you're saying too is that's just one of several ethical issues that people should be concerned about here. That obviously we're putting sensitive data, if you're interacting with a chatbot on a mental health, digital mental health tool service, that sensitive data might be going somewhere. So there's that privacy issue. But like you said before, with the example of the eating disorder chatbot, there's also many other ethical issues at play here about doing no harm and providing benefit that are equally as concerning. And that doesn't obviously just apply to chatbots too. That's also applicable to all sorts of apps that we're seeing, and apps and products that we're seeing developed in these commercial spaces outside the oversight of the healthcare system. Tracking apps and apps for coping strategies and things like that, that people can just access freely. Are there any other sort of major legal and ethical challenges that you're seeing play out in this space?
I suppose there are several, and I don't know that I'll be able to describe all of them that I've looked at. I've written a sort of 90-page report with some colleagues that tries to go through some of them, but maybe another one is security. There was an example of a company in Finland who was the largest private provider of psychoanalysis or therapy, talk therapy that it was providing online, and it was a company called Vastamo. And in 2019, Vastamo was subject to a hacking event in which the records of 30,000 plus people in Finland were stolen. And each one of those individuals received, or at least according to reports by over 20,000 people, received extortion threats where they were asked to pay some kind of Bitcoin into an anonymous account under the threat that their records would be released. And the records included highly sensitive information, including sexuality that hadn't been revealed to family and friends, experiences or thoughts of self-harm and suicide, about as sensitive as you could possibly get.
Yeah.
And ultimately that data was released, and how widely disseminated in the public that was, or whether it just stayed in some dark corner of the internet, I'm not sure. But according to Finland's Attorney General at the time, it was potentially the largest criminal case in Finnish history, just because
Wow.
of the sheer number of victims. So again, this should send alarm bells to us. I mean, I'm a legal academic, and I suppose we tend towards identifying when things go dreadfully wrong, which mercifully is very uncommon. So I don't want what I'm saying to suggest that, it's completely, it's so fraught that it's, worth not entering into, because clearly there are extremely beneficial things that come from online therapy. And there's nothing about the kind of remote connection to a therapist or to someone offering or seeking support that would undermine the kind of power of that therapeutic encounter. But at the very least, these stories should give us pause for caution. And just this year in Finland, there have been criminal prosecutions of the CEO of that company for negligent or reckless use of people's personal data. And indeed, there's charges being leveled against the person who they allege undertook the hacking. So what's troubling about that case is that Finland was widely regarded as having some of the most robust health data protection arrangements in the EU. So again, I think a pause for caution about how data is stored about individuals, what is recorded, how accessible it is, and ensuring the safety and security of individuals who are accessing some kind of support online. That's a really big one for me. And I haven't even spoken about discrimination and other things like that, but that's another big one to
So
ponder.
many issues to unpack, and I think you make a really good point there that we should be hearing the alarm bells when we hear stories like this. There should be cause for concern and caution, but at the same time realizing that this isn't demonizing the whole field and going, it's all bad, stay away from it, because there is such benefit to it. And that's, our part of our role here is educating people in just how helpful it can be for people in getting the right care to the right people at the right time. But we, at the same time, have to exercise caution going forward, not just barging in with our blinkers on, because it is such a new space. And right now we're all navigating our way through it, and figuring out ways to regulate and create safety. So we just have to walk into it cautiously and encouraging people to ask those questions and think critically about the tools that they're coming across. I think is really key. And the examples you've given are really fascinating. And a point I wanted to kind of make about it was that obviously a lot of those are are occurring in the context of other health systems, especially the US health system. We know their system's quite heavily privatized. And has that, like you said, really flourishing competitive market for digital mental health products. They call them digital therapeutics over there, compared to here in Australia, where we've had a bit of a different approach. We've invested a great deal of public funding into developing a lot of free, nationally available digital mental health services. So if you're looking at the two sort of legal systems with how they're faring with those, I guess, different healthcare systems, how is the system in Australia faring with those kinds of challenges?
Look, I think in a lot of ways Australia is leading the world, not just in the proliferation of really good practices in the digital mental health space and the investment from government that has driven a lot of that, but also in the kind of governance and oversight. And I'm thinking specifically about the work of the Australian Commission on Quality and Safety in Healthcare and their standards. Sorry, I've gotten the name wrong. Forgive me. And their work on the digital mental health standards, which are really an extraordinary kind of document by global standards to try to create best practice in kind of overseeing and governing and having responsible kinds of digital mental health practices. And I think you're absolutely right that difference between somewhere like Australia and the US is pronounced and does create different issues. In the US, that highly commercial market of healthcare providers means that data concerning individuals' mental health can be far more lucrative, I suppose, and the trade in that data can be far more lucrative, where it could be used to target people with advertising for commercial pharmaceutical products, which is not allowed here in Australia. So the issues are very different. And thankfully, we haven't seen any kind of major problem concerning the use of digital mental health technologies where a company has done something irresponsible or been found to have violated some kind of law. So that's really positive. And I think it probably comes back to that one of the points you made during the introduction, and one of the things that I think is so commendable about MPRAC is that it's concerned with amplifying the voices and perspectives of those in publicly funded arrangements that are using digital technologies. And I think by virtue of that public governance and the kind of oversight that comes with that sector, there is less likely to be this mentality of moving fast and breaking things, which is a famous mantra for Facebook or some Silicon Valley company, but which I think everyone could agree would be wildly inappropriate in the mental health context. So I think we very much benefit from the way things have developed in Australia. And I'm not suggesting it's perfect. I think there have been some missteps, but I do think we have a lot to be grateful for in Australia, and I think there's some really commendable practices that people around the world are looking to.
And we're definitely really happy and proud to have the national safety and quality standards. We spoke to that team not long ago. Do you think those standards, as they go far enough to protect consumer safety?
Well, I don't think it's possible at this point to definitively say yes or no, and I'm certainly not going to do so, because I think it remains to be seen. They have been developed in a way that is probably the most consultative of any that I've seen internationally, and I believe that they are the first main sort of health regulator to come up with a really comprehensive set of standards to try to guide the sector. And on those 2 points alone, they should be congratulated heartily and serve as a bit of a beacon for the rest of the world. There's an open question, I suppose, as to whether they will achieve what they set out to do, and the proof will be in the pudding as time goes on and as we see the standards taken up. They have been designed in a really intelligent way where not only can big providers who can afford to go through the accreditation process will be able to do so, but also some of those smaller operations will have a different avenue for gaining accreditation. So it's not going to fall into that problem of only the big providers being able to gain accreditation. So it really leaves room for smaller operators to try to gain accreditation under the standards. There's probably an open question about the voluntary nature of the scheme and whether that will remain effective. You know, the government has stayed quite cautious in not wanting to over-regulate. So this is arguably a reasonably light touch approach, given that, you know, one volunteers to become accredited under the standards. And hopefully that will really guide the practices of healthcare practitioners in directing patients and clients to those services that have been accredited. I suppose in the future, if we have some instances like with the Better Health incident in the US or Vastamo in Finland, maybe questions will be asked as to whether the standards need to become compulsory in certain respects, or maybe compulsory for publicly funded programs. But I think at this point that is not a question we can really answer. And it also remains to be seen whether the other parts of our laws are going to be able to regulate some of those kind of activities that we've seen overseas that really warrant some kind of intervention. So that would include the Australian Consumer Commission and, you know, the new data protection and privacy laws that come in, and the regulators in that space. If they are able to enforce some of the things that would keep companies that aren't looking for accreditation under the digital mental health standards in line, then maybe we've got the balance right in how the regulation happens.
So what I'm hearing is that we've made a really good start here in Australia with what we've got with the standards and existing laws. And so it, you know, at the moment things are looking pretty good, and where we'll wait and see to, you know, see how they play out and see how they manage things as they develop, essentially.
That's right. I agree with that.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's going to make the job easier for health practitioners and clinicians who are in the position of having to make decisions about, you know, who to refer where and that kind of thing. Along that line, you know, coming down to, you know, what us as health practitioners need to be aware of and on the lookout for, considering that a lot of these technologies are already embedded into the fabric of our online interactions. They're already here. They're there. How do we start to build ethical frameworks into these structures? You know, as health professionals, how do we work with these technologies in the mental health setting in ways that keep people safe? Like what kind of stuff what kind of ethical principles do we need to consider?
Sure. Well, I mean, as a legal researcher who spends a lot of my time in a law school surrounded by books and computers and students, I'm probably not actually the person to answer that, insofar as, you know, it's going to be a lot of frontline practitioners as well as service users who are receiving support to try to identify what those principles should be. I suppose one of the privileges of my role is that I've been able to do research on this topic, including collaborating with healthcare practitioners, with service user representatives, with policymakers, and even with industry representatives. And in particular, I've had the privilege of working with an organisation called the E-Mental Health International Collaborative. It's based in New Zealand, but it's really an international network for which Australia plays a prominent role, that looks at the use of digital mental health technologies. And I suppose it provides a sort of non-government organisation place for all of these different groups to come together and to try to identify how good practice can lead the way and serve as a standard for other countries, and how countries can work together to promote the use of digital mental health technologies where it's helpful. And I was the inaugural chair or co-chair rather, of the special interest group concerning law and medicine with my colleague in New Zealand, Mr. Richmond Wee, who is a lawyer and an ethicist. And together we drafted a set of themes in a position statement for EMIC, and we approached members of the network, the international network, including psychiatrists, psychologists, again, service user representatives, ethicists, and policymakers and industry representatives, and proposed several themes which were sort of fine-tuned, and we reduced them to, well, 7 really. The overarching one was close consultation with service users to ensure that kind of oversight and accountability to the very people whom this technology is designed to assist. And then there were more broad principles like privacy, accountability, transparency and explainability, safety and security for the reasons I've discussed earlier, fairness and non-discrimination, which we haven't really touched upon, but relates to issues of ensuring that people aren't stuck in the digital divide where they don't have access to key services because, services have been designed around the use of digital technologies, which may not be getting to the people who need it most, or data being used against people in ways that may be discriminatory. And then a final principle we characterized as professional responsibility and evidence-based practice. So these are more themes, I suppose, than principles, but we hope that they offer some kinds of ways of explaining the use of digital technologies in mental health context that would be helpful for clinicians. But I suspect, practitioners will be doing their own work in their professional bodies to identify ways to really operationalize these principles in their own practice, and other principles that we haven't looked at. And you mentioned beneficence before, and non-maleficence, and justice, and promoting the autonomy of users. All of these are likely to be relevant.
Absolutely. And when it comes to educating our clients about these kinds of issues and helping them navigate digital services, if that's if we're integrating them into practice, what would you say are some key messages for clinicians in helping clients navigate this space?
Gosh, again, I don't particularly feel equipped as a socio-legal scholar, but at least from my perspective, it would be, I think clarity about the kind of evidence base for the practices, clarity about any concerns around privacy and data protection, and clarity about whether there has been some kind of accreditation or approval by maybe an external body that is ideally publicly funded and governed, which can identify where there has been good practice or otherwise. I know in the US, of all places, the Department of Veterans has one of the best in the US for sort of pointing out the evidence base for particular practices, identifying privacy protections that exist in particular practices and products. So I think we need those kind of things, and here in Australia we have Head to Health and other resources, and MPRAC would be probably where I'd direct people if I was perfectly honest, but those would be my kind of broad suggestions.
Yeah, no, those are great, and I think really critical too, because there is a lot out there, and an increasing amount too that looks very shiny and looks like it does, like they'll do a good job and so forth. But when you dig a little deeper, the evidence isn't there, or the privacy is not there, or some of those really critical things that we would absolutely expect in any other kind of treatment, face-to-face treatment. They're not there for a lot of these digital tools.
Exactly. I think that's really well put, and in some ways, what you're alluding to is maybe that there's a kind of hype that surrounds technological or digital technological approaches, which can sometimes turn off people's critical faculties for reflecting on those matters. Yes, if this was something that was being arranged face-to-face, would you recommend it to your clients? And what would you need to know to recommend it to your clients? That might be a good place to start, because I think you might bring a more critical eye to something, being put on, promises the world. And my colleagues at Melbourne University in the psychological sciences and in law, Professor Nicholas Van Dam and Professor Jeannie Patterson have been doing some really good work on well-being apps and mindfulness apps, and have similarly sort of alluded to problems with evidence base and problems with the kind of claims being put forward by the apps, which aren't being received perhaps as critically as they ought to be. So yeah, keeping that critical eye out and treading cautiously.
Yes, that's a good note to finish up on. Well, Piers, you've shared some fascinating insights and cases that I think will help guide us as health professionals through this new wave of digital mental health that many big corporations and tech companies seem to be riding. And obviously AI and technology in general holds a lot of promise, but ultimately it's going to present certain challenges as well for health professionals. But in meeting those challenges, we as clinicians carry the potential to transform the field. It will require us to obviously increase our awareness and educate ourselves and our clients about how to leverage these technologies safely. And if we can do that, then technology and AI can really change the game for mental health in so many ways. So yeah, Piers, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks.